まず最初によそものネットさん作成の動画、汚染水の海洋放出反対メッセージナンバー5、ティム・ディア・ジョーンズ氏をご覧いただきます。
Okay, I'm going to talk to you about the disposal of Fukushima's tritiated water. And the first thing to mention is that in the 1950s, when the nuclear industry started discharges of very large quantities of liquid radioactive waste to sea, it had no knowledge of the way radioactivity would behave in marine environments. So, in the absence of any scientific data, the nuclear industry came up with a hypothesis that liquid tritium as tritiated water was of low biological significance because it had a short half-life. It would dissolve into infinity once in the marine environment, and it was a low activity radioactive emitter, which they assumed would generate very low doses from the consumption of fish only. This hypothesis quickly became fossilized as a nuclear orthodoxy, despite the absence of scientific evidence to support it. Because the greatest volume of aggregated radioactivity, as measured in terms of terabecquerels, discharged to sea from most nuclear reactors does actually consist of tritiated water, the defense of this orthodoxy has been of huge importance to the nuclear industry. However, their claim that tritium is of low radiological significance has now been shown to be comprehensively inaccurate, but sadly the industry refuses to adopt the outcomes of recent scientific studies, which have contradicted pretty much every aspect of the official position. So particularly post the 1990s, research published in peer-reviewed journals has conclusively proved that the tritium in discharged water quickly becomes incorporated into the cells of organic, plant and microorganic material in marine environments. That research has proved that organically bound tritium, or OBT, accumulates in fine sediments suspended in the water column or deposited in mudflats, especially those mudflats with a high percentage of organic material, where the OBT can be enriched in the sediment by up to 250 times greater than the concentrations found in the ambient seawater. Marine animals which consume this organic material accumulate OBT at a faster rate than those exposed only to tritiated water. As a result, organically bound tritium is far more biologically mobile through marine food webs than non-organically bound tritium. So organically bound tritium is most highly bioaccumulated in species near the apex of the marine consumers, such as predatory fish and sea mammals. Such species typically hold concentrations between 2,000 and 6,000 times greater than the concentrations found in the ambient water, but they have been shown to reach up to 61,000 becquerels to the kilogram in some species. Organically bound tritium also has a far longer half-life within biological entities and is more persistent in the environment than tritium as tritiated water. So it's clear that organically bound tritium is of far greater dose significance than tritiated water, and it's also clear that there is significant risk of elevated human dietary doses of marine sourced tritium via seafoods and organically bound tritium. As far back as 2009, independent research published in the Journal of Environmental Radioactivity commented that nuclear industry recommendations and advice on the dosimetric significance of tritiated water was not supported by the evidence and definitely required a reconsideration. However, it's clear from the current propaganda from the pro-nuclear industry lobbyists who proposed the discharge at Fukushima that these concerns and comments have not been acted upon and the nuclear interests have not reconsidered their position or acted on the new evidence. So clearly, in the context of the information I've just shared with you, there is a very high potential for seafood consumers to receive significant dietary doses of tritium in its organically bound form from the consumption of both marine plant and animal products. Independent researchers now confirm that the seafood dietary pathway, however, is not the only way that human populations may receive doses of tritium and organically bound tritium. Because it is part of the nuclear orthodoxy that tritium, as tritiated water, dissolves in seawater, the industry has failed to conduct any research on the implications of this fact. However, research on the behavior and fate of other soluble radioisotopes and those which bond to organic marine microparticles provides a powerful indication of the behavior and fate of tritium and organically bound tritium in marine and coastal environments. In the UK, studies have clearly shown repeatedly that coastal pastures washed and flooded by high tide and storm surge become heavily contaminated with soluble and organically bonded radioactivity. And this has been proved to deliver dietary doses of marine radioactivity through the consumption of dairy and meat products from animals reared on tide-washed pastures. Similarly, when coastal and urban industrial environments have been flooded by storm surge and high tide events, many thousands of tons of marine water and sediment containing soluble and particle incorporated radioactivity have exposed both residents and cleanup crews to significant doses via contact and inhalation pathways. Another significant tritium and organically bound tritium dose pathway, clearly demonstrated by the behavior of soluble and organic particle radioactivity studied in the UK, is the sea to land transfer of marine aerosols and sea spray generated in the surf zone and blown at least 10 miles inland. This mechanism is proved to deposit soluble radioactivity onto pasture grass and other crops from where it enters the agricultural food chain and delivers doses to human consumers at least 10 miles inland. Given the fact that this airborne sea spray and marine aerosols laden with soluble radioactivity is clearly shown to penetrate up to 10 miles into the terrestrial coastal zone, it appears inevitable that coastal zone populations will also be exposed to inhalation doses of airborne radioactivity. Under conditions of prevailing onshore winds on the UK Atlantic coast, this sea spray and marine aerosol sea-to-land pathway has been estimated to operate for over 50% of the year. And it seems quite likely that on the Honshu coast of the Pacific Ocean, that similar mechanisms will prevail. So much PR has been given to the TEPCO claims that other radionuclides have been filtered out of the stored water, but this has failed to point out that the process cannot remove all of the other radionuclides. There is a broad consensus amongst independent workers that the water will still contain detectable quantities of strontium-90, cobalt-60, iodine-129, ruthenium-106, cesium-137, and carbon-14. And that around 70% of the water still requires additional cleaning. This should not be forgotten when discussing the proposal to sea dump the stored tritiated water. As an example of the impact of sea-to-land transfer mechanisms, we can look at a review of a study carried out in the UK coastal zone between 1979 and 1985. When a medical team composed of GPs, a hospital medical consultant, a senior hospital medical registrar, and a medical statistician carried out research on the body concentration of cesium-137 in subjects from the islands of North Uist off the west coast of Scotland. Now, North Uist is approximately 250 kilometres downstream of the Sellafield reprocessor site. Sea discharged radioactive wastes are discharged from Sellafield and transported through the Hebridean Island group and past North Uist by a strong northward flowing current. The research on the island made use of whole body analysis at the Scottish University's Research Reactor Centre and 96-hour gamma counting analysis of subjects' urine and dietary intake, including island-grown milk, lamb, fish, seaweed, vegetables, pasture grass, and wild vegetation. This is the only dietary dose assessment study which I have ever come across where such a wealth of actual empirical data has been deployed. Almost all of these studies that I've seen are based on largely hypothetical model data using a less effective 15-hour gamma count. The research on the island of North Uist found that the island environment from the rich coastal farmlands through to the uncultivated moorland of the interior was contaminated with cesium-137. Cesium-137 was found in island seaweeds used as fertilizer and animal feed, and in wild foods such as venison and mushrooms, and in the island peat used for domestic fuel. Cesium-137 was found in all samples analysed. Foodstuff concentrations were higher in island-grown foodstuffs than in their mainland equivalents. The radiological fingerprint ratio of cesium-137 to cesium-134 clearly implicated the Sellafield sea discharge as a source of the cesium that was being found. And the cesium was clearly transferred from the sea to land via the range of mechanisms that I discussed earlier. It was found that the cesium concentrations in islander urine was 6 times higher than in the mainland controls. And the islanders had 5 times higher body concentrations of cesium-137 than the mainland control subjects. It was found that the islander with the highest body concentration of Sellafield sea-derived cesium-137 ate no fish or seafood, but lived within 50 meters of the coast and farmed sheep and dairy and beef cattle with access to coastal grassland, inland grassland, and the shoreline. Islanders who consumed greater amounts of island-grown produce were shown to have higher body concentrations of Sellafield-derived cesium-137 than those who consumed greater amounts of imported shop food. Half of the 30 local coastal critical groups living next to UK nuclear sites with liquid radioactive discharges and receiving doses of multiple nuclides from usually calculated for 7 or more, received dietary doses from seafood lower than 10 microsieverts. By comparison, the average islander in the North US study, exposure to marine-sourced dietary cesium alone via terrestrial foodstuffs was 13.7 microsieverts per year. So I think that kind of comparison gives you an idea of how serious and important the sea-to-land transfer mechanisms can be in terms of dose. Right, so there's the background to the discharges. Let's have a look at the actual parameters that control the movement of any radioactivity discharge from Fukushima. So the major influence there is the Oyashio current. This Oyashio is a strong, coherent southward flowing current carrying polar water close inshore along the entire 250-kilometer length of the Pacific coast of Honshu. It's highly relevant in the context of the organic bonding of tritium to note that the Oyashio current is rich in organic material. In general, the Honshu coast to the south of Fukushima consists of a narrow coastal plain backed by higher ground from which a number of rivers carrying yet more organically rich sediment flow east into the Pacific to join the Oyashio. Where it's not urban or industrialized, significant areas of the coastal zone are agricultural. So urbanization of almost all of the river deltas along that coastline with extensive land reclamation and port development mean that many of those rivers no longer have recognizable delta systems and shoreline fine sediment deposits like mudflats and salt marshes. The unbroken nature of this coast with few sheltered low energy environments where fine sediments can be deposited also means that as a result of these factors, the coherent and southward moving Oyashio current carries very high levels of mineral and organic fine sediments, which are unable to deposit out in the coastline environment. This means that the Oyashio is very suitable for the formation and transport of organically bound tritium. Clearly, consumers of seaweeds, fish and mammals raised in the Oyashio environment will be exposed to significant and detectable dietary doses of both tritiated water and organically bound tritium. In addition, during periods of onshore wind and enhanced wave activity, the Honshu coasts downstream and south of Fukushima will also be subject to sea-to-land transfer of tritium as both tritiated water and OBT in aerosols and sea spray and in episodes of coastal flooding. Prolonged periods of onshore wind are a strong feature of the annual meteorological cycle, and the east coast of Honshu, as everybody will know, is a victim of numerous tropical cyclonic storms. I have no idea of the data on the percentage of the year in which relevant onshore onshore wind speeds with speeds in excess of 10 kilometers per hour will blow onto this coast. But since these are prevailing winds, I would expect the percentage to be pretty high. So, such sea-to-land transfer of marine sea sprays and aerosols will deliver both dietary and inhalation doses to coastal zone populations at least 10 miles inland from the Honshu coast via the mechanisms discussed earlier. Pacific coast of Honshu is subject to frequent coastal flooding events, which can impact both agricultural and urban areas. And this parameter will also generate dietary, contact, and inhalation doses of tritiated water and OBT. And of course, the other radionuclides which haven't been scrubbed out of that water. In the context of the evidence summarized above, I can confirm that the release of the massive quantities of Fukushima's stored water has the potential to deliver significant and major inhalation and dietary doses to Honshu coastal zone populations. These populations have already been in receipt of earlier post-meltdown Fukushima doses from the marine environment, and the proposed release of the stored liquids will only exacerbate this plight. It is a fact that Japanese nuclear authorities have not researched the historical impacts on Honshu distant coastal communities and their environments, and this strongly implies that they will not conduct any such investigations after dumping the tritiated water as proposed. These groups along the Honshu coast have already been abandoned by nuclear science, and it seems highly likely that they will soon be sacrificial victims to the nuclear industry's need and desire to get rid of Fukushima's millions of gallons of tritiated water. Thank you for listening.
で、ここから後半のですね、海底堆積物の浚渫工事問題、ヒンクリーポイント C と福島第一の比較というテーマでお話しいただきます。So, we are starting the second half of the conference, which is entitled Problems Related to the Dredge of Seabed Sediments, Hinkley Point C and Fukushima Daiichi. So, Tim, you have the floor.
Hello, everybody, and thank you to Yosomono for inviting me to speak to you today.
皆さん、こんにちは。今日は、よそものネットと、サヨゲン神戸アクションでご招待していただいてありがとうございます。
I shall talk today, of course, about the dredging at Fukushima Daiichi, but I shall start off by referring to my experiences of studying dredging of seabed sediments at the Hinkley Point C nuclear power station in the UK, where I have 5 years experience of researching and campaigning on that issue.
もちろんメインテーマは福島第一の海底トンネル工事なんですけれども、私はこの5年間調査に関わってきましたので、英国のヒンクリーポイント C のやはり海底パイプラインを通すための浚渫工事の問題についてまず言及したいと思います。
At Hinkley C, the UK government and its nuclear regulators permitted the dredging and sea disposal of around about 1 million tons of radioactive seabed sediments in order to put a cap on a pipeline which they had built for the discharge of liquid radioactive wastes. So very similar to what is being proposed at Fukushima.
ヒンクリーポイント C では福島第一と非常に類似点があるんですが、英国、政府と英国の原子力規制庁は、パイプラインの上に放出口に投手口っていうヘッドワークっていうコンクリートの、ピースがあるんですけれども、それを 設置するために、100万トンの、浚渫工事を許可しました。そして、そして、その浚渫工事で出た汚泥ですよ。汚染した汚泥を海に投棄することに対しても許可を出しました。Sorry.
The tunnels that were dredged that were excavated at Hinckley were about 1.5 kilometers long, and they stretched from the shore out to sea. And the dredging was undertaken not to build the tunnels, but to create a hole in which the nuclear industry would lower a concrete structure onto the end of the pipeline.
ヒンクリーポイント C での、トンネルの浚渫工事について言いますと、放出口は、海岸から 1.5km のところで、パイプライン、浚渫工事に関して一番大事なのは、投手口ですね、ヘッドワークを沈めるための、穴の浚渫工事が最も重要になります。
So, the sediments, the 1,000,000 tons of sediments that were to be dredged from Hinckley had been the receiving environment of liquid radioactive waste discharges from 4 reactors for over 50 years. And those liquid discharges are, I'll refer to them in a minute. Please translate the last sentence, Kurumi. Sorry.
で、このヒンクリーポイント C の、海底というのは、海底環境というのは、放射性廃棄物をずっと50年以上にわたって、受け続けてきました。で、ヒンクリーの環境としては、原子炉が4基あります。
Pretty much all nuclear reactors discharge liquid effluents containing between 50 and 60 different forms of radioactivity. These would be gamma emitters, beta emitters, and alpha emitters. So you would get cesium, tritium, and plutonium and americium in those discharges. And at Hinckley, the records indicate that all of those reactors had had unquantified leaks of radioactive material, and that those, because they were unquantified, we don't really understand exactly how much radioactivity had been discharged anyway.
ヒンクリーの場合、福島で問題だと思うんですけれども、50から60の放射性核種が排出されています。で、その中にはセシウム、プルトニウム、アルメシウムなどのアルファ、ベータ、ガンマ線を出す核種が含まれています。そしてヒンクリーからは一体どれぐらいの量が、排出されたのか、定義的にはよく分かってない量のものが、出ています。そして、その中には規制上排出されたものもあれば、アクシデントで、排出されたものもあります。
In addition to that particular issue, it is also fairly certain that 2 of those reactors at Hinckley had been used for the manufacture of plutonium, weapons-grade plutonium, for the UK and USA nuclear weapons, and that during that process there had been unauthorized leaks from those specific sites, leading to a probable discharge of plutonium and uranium microparticles down the pipelines and into the marine environment and the sediments.
そして、ヒンクリーポイントの原子炉の2基は、核兵器の製作のために使われていたため、それは英国あるいはアメリカ合衆国の核兵器なんですけれども、 非合法のですね、オーソライズされていないプルトニウム、そしてウランの微粒子の漏出、排出があり、これらが海底に、海洋環境を汚染しています。
Okay, so you can see from what I've outlined that there are possible similarities between the proposed action at Fukushima, the dredging and disposal, and what happened at Hinkley. So I'll just run briefly through the Fukushima material.
ではヒンクリーポイントと、福島第一には類似点があるんですが、ここからざっと福島第一の方を見ていきたいと思います。
So Fukushima in marine environment has been receiving 50 years worth of both quantified permitted and unquantified leaked radioactive liquid discharges from 6 reactors.
福島第一の方の、海底環境はですね、やっぱり50年にわたって、合法で量が分かっているもの、そして非合法で漏出ですね、意図されていない漏出も含めて、海洋汚染がされています。そして福島には原子炉が6基あります。
In addition to that, and unlike Hinkley, the Fukushima site has also suffered the catastrophic accident that leads to the problems we're discussing today. There is a consensus that because the winds were blowing from the land to the sea during much of the event, large quantities of the radioactivity in the cloud were deposited onto the marine environment. And so we're in the situation really where we don't have a decent idea of exactly how much radioactivity was discharged. There's been a lot of hypothesis, but the empirical evidence remains very uncertain.
しかし、ヒンクリーポイントと違って、福島第一の場合には過酷事故を起こしています。そしてこの事故直後、風が太平洋側に吹いていたために、プルームの多くの運ばれた多くの放射性核種は海にフォールアウトしています。で、私たちはこの海峡にフォールアウトした汚染の放射能の量が一体どれぐらいあったのか、正確なことは全く分かっていません。仮説はありますが、仮説に過ぎません。
So, both sites are close to the point source of reactor liquid discharges to sea.
そしてヒンクリーポイントと福島第一両方とも、放出口ですね、海洋放出するための放出口に、近いところにあります。
Both sites have been receiving historical discharges of radioactivity for over 50 years.
両方とも50年以上にわたって、過去に、原子炉から放出、漏出を受けています。
And those discharges have consisted of 50 to 60 different radionuclides.
そして50から60の放射性各種の廃棄物を排出し続けています。
And both sites have experienced unauthorized discharges and leaks, and nobody has a proper understanding of exactly how much radioactivity was discharged during those leak incidents.
両方のサイトで無許可の排出、漏洩があって、一体どれぐらいの量の排出があったのか、量的には分かっていません。
And in the end, because of the Fukushima disaster incident, it's clear that matters in the Fukushima environment are much, much worse, with much higher radioactivity discharges, particularly from the disaster incident, leading to potentially much greater problems than we have seen at Hinkley.
結果的には、過酷事故のため、福島第一からの近くの海洋環境っていうのは、ヒンクリーポイントよりも深刻な汚染を受けているものと考えられます。
So in the Hinckley case, in 2017, when the proposal first emerged, I initiated a campaign to have the dredge and the dumping postponed until some simple baseline data on the possible behavior of the radioactivity had been collected and publicized. And as part of that campaign, it identified a small number of very important questions which needed to be cleared up before the proposed dredge was permitted.
ヒンクリーポイントについて申し上げますと、2017年に浚渫工事の企画が出たときに、私たちは反対運動を始めました。で、その反対運動の中で、許可するこの工事を許可する前に基本的データの公開をしてほしいということを要請しました。
So we came up, the campaign at Hinckley asked 6 questions.
で、キャンペーン反対運動から6つの質問を提案しました。
Number 1, what was the concentration of the 50 to 60 radionuclides discharged from the Hinckley site in the sediments that were going to be dredged and dumped?
ヒンクリーポイントから、排出されている50から60の放射性核種の、濃度を教えてほしい。
What concentrations, number 2 question, what concentrations of gamma, beta and alpha emitters were present in the pre-dredge and dump coastal environments, not only close to Hinckley, but at points distant and downstream of the proposed dredge and dump sites?
ガンマ、アルファ、ベータ線を発する各種の濃度を教えてほしい。で、それはその工事をする前の、状態を教えてほしい。で、それも、排出する地点から、近いところだけでなく、遠距離にある下流の沿岸地帯の、状況も教えてほしい。
Our question 3 was to ask what doses of man-made radioactivity were the coastal populations in the near and distant regions downstream of the discharge points, what were the doses that people were receiving?
3つ目の、質問はですね、人為的放射能の線量がどれぐらいあったか。で、それは、沿岸の人口に対してですね。で、その沿岸の場所っていうのは近いだけでなくて遠いところでもデータを教えてほしいと。それが3番目です。
Question 4 was to ask which of the coastal zone population groups were most susceptible or likely to have acquired the highest doses of man-made radioactivity following 50 years length of radioactive liquid discharges to sea.
50年以上放射性物質の、排出を受けていた、沿岸の住民の中で一番被曝リスクにさらされているのはどのあたりの住民かというのが、4つ目の質問です。
Question 5 was to ask when the sediment was dredged and dumped, what was the end point of the material that was being dumped and where would it end up after having been disturbed and released into the marine environment?
浚渫工事の後ですね、その出た汚泥を海洋投棄したときに、その影響のプリウムですね、海のプリウムが、到達した最長地点、一番遠いところでどこまで行ったか、それを教えてほしい。
And our 6th and final question was to ask the authorities what pathways of exposure were coastal populations and marine stakeholders likely to receive doses of man-made radioactivity because of the dredge and dump activity.
で、最後の6つ目の質問ですけれども、この沿岸のリスクにさらされている住民の被爆というのは、どういう経路で被爆するのか、それを教えてほしいというのが最後の質問です。
So we think, in our experience, that these questions apply equally to the Fukushima case, but we note that our government did not have the answers to those questions, and we suspect from what we have read that the Japanese government doesn't have answers to those questions either.
でこれらの質問は、福島第一にも同様に適用されるような質問です。で、私たちの英国での経験に照らしますと、英国政府はこの質問に対して回答しませんでした。で、おそらく日本政府もこれらの質問に対する回答は持っていないと思われます。
We, as a result of putting these questions, we were told that the UK government and the nuclear industry would not carry out research work which would answer those questions. And the UK government licensed that enormous dredge and dump pretty much on the basis of what the nuclear industry told them.
英国政府と原子力産業がこれらの、質問に回答するための調査をやらないということはもう明白であって やろうとしませんでした。そして英国政府は原子力産業が出したデータに基づいてこの工事の許可を出しました。
So what we did was to ask them and make legal queries of the UK government, and we were told that the decisions were made on the basis of international guidelines about how to dredge and dispose of radioactive material, and that the UK guidelines were based on guidances issued by the International Atomic Energy Agency.
そこで私たち英国の住民はですね、法廷に訴えたんですけれども、でその法廷からの回答というのは、この工事とその海洋投棄に関しては国際的なガイドラインに基づいている。で、英国のガイドラインというのは IAEA のガイダンスに基づいているという回答を受けました。
I note that the IAEA.
Sorry, excuse me, Tim. When you switch to the following subjects, please say next slide, please.
Yeah, we've just got right here. Yeah, there were a lot of different slides came up, and now we're back on track. So here we are. So we discovered that the guidance issued by IAEA had originally been written, I think, in 1972.
IAEA の、ガイダンスっていうのは、最初に書かれたのは1972年であると思います。
And when we looked at that guidance in detail and its subsequent occasional updates, we realized that actually the scientific understanding that it reflected in 1972 a lot of the scientific understanding has now changed about the behavior of radioactivity. So therefore now we see that recent empirical work reported by academics and researchers and published in peer-reviewed scientific journals shows that the IAEA guidances are now significantly out of date.
でこの1972年の、ガイダンスおよびその後の更新を見ていますと、72年以降の科学的調査研究の成果が取り入れられていないということが分かります。で、これ以降多くの査読付き専門誌で、 科学上の認められた成果が発表されたのですが、それはすべてこの中には取り入れられていません。
Next slide, please.
次のスライドお願いします。
Okay, it hasn't. Oops.
Oops.
There we are. Okay, so a lot of this, I should be very brief on this slide because a lot of it has been covered in the presentation that was showed to you earlier. But it's worth noting that even the UK Atomic Energy Authority has produced data proving the empirical facts of sea to land transfer.
でこのスライドについては、さっきの動画でたくさん説明したので短めに説明しますが、一つだけ付け加えておきたいのは、英国の原子力規制庁でさえ、海から陸への汚染の放射性汚染の移動というのに関する、データを発表しています。
And there is also a lot of individual and independent academic and campaigners' research work to support the material that I outlined in that earlier report. So what we have here is a situation where it's evident to campaigners in the UK that the nuclear industry and the government have been very lax about updating the science. And if you want further details of this, I think we will have a script available for sharing.
そしてですね、原子力産業から独立した、反対運動家などが中心になったリサーチが実現されていますが、それについても全く無視されています。ですので、原子力産業がこれらのデータのアップデートですね、更新に対して非常に怠けているというか、ちゃんとフォローしてないということが分かります。で、これについてご質問のある方は、テキストがありますので、言ってくださればご紹介いたします。
So, next slide, please. So what we also discovered was that there are big flaws in the way the IAEA have recommended that routine and post-accident sampling and analysis of radioactivity in marine sediments and seawater is carried out. And yeah, sorry, Karumi.
はい、IAEA の勧告ですが、海底堆積物および海水のルーティン上および事故後のサンプリングと分析に関する勧告には非常に大きな欠陥があります。
We discovered that the IAEA guidelines have been incorporated into nation-state guidelines, and that the guidelines, for instance, advise a major focus on gamma emitters, especially cesium-137. But the flaw is that that means there is a reduced focus on beta emitters such as strontium-90 and a very low focus on alpha emitters like plutonium and americium.
IAEA のガイダンスっていうのは、それを取り入れている多くの国があるわけですけれども、最も、大きな欠陥というのは、それが一番重点を置いているのは、 ガンマ線を発生する、放射性核子であり、例えばセシウム137のようなものです。そして比較的というか重点をほとんど置いていないのがストロンチウム90などのベータ線を出す核種、そして、アルファ線を出すプルトニウムとかアルメシウムに至ってはほとんど全くと言っていいほど考慮されていません。
Good. We also discovered that the IAEA guidance and national state guidances use only a 15-hour analytical counting time for most of their monitoring work. But there is a massive empirical scientific background saying that a 3-day time scale lowers the detection or less than limits and provides much more accurate information than the 15-hour counting time.
もう一つの点はですね、モニタリングに関して IAEA のガイダンスは15時間の分析時間を使っています。しかし、独立した調査などの結果によると明らかですが、15時間ではなく3日間の分析時間を費やすと、例えば検出限界がもっともっと下がって、詳細な的確なデータを取得することができるということが分かっています。
We can also report that these guidances do admit that plutonium, for instance, accumulates in fine and organic seabed sediments, but they do not require identification of marine fine sediments as a priority exercise when investigating alpha emitters.
こういうこのガイダンスは、例えばそのプルトニウムが非常に微細な粒子に、の堆積物に含まれているということを言ってはいるんですが、それではじゃあ、このプルトニウムなどを含むような微細な粒子の調査をするかというと、それはやらない。
There is more detail provided in the script that we may share with you. And meanwhile, can we have the next slide, please?
これらに関してテキストがありますので、先ほど言いましたけれども、ご希望があれば言ってきてください。
Hi, Madoka. One of the big problems with dredging and dumping is shown in these pictures on these slides. You cannot dredge the seabed without creating a plume, as and you cannot dump material without creating a plume. So you can see how long these plumes are. And I've done quite a lot of work on dredging and disposal in different situations, not all of them radioactivity, some of them chemical.
Okay, let me translate that. 先ほどのスライドで、見れたと思いますけど、こういう、浚渫、そして、投棄に関する一つ大きな問題は、こういうプルーム、堆積物が、水の中に、こう広がっていくことなんですけど、そういうプルームを作らないで、できません。この浚渫とかはね。で、非常に長い、広いプルームもできます。で、私はこういうプルームに関する研究も、いろいろ、していますけど、放射能性のものとそうでないものも、調査しています。
There is a huge body of scientific evidence which has been peer reviewed, which shows that that many chemicals and a lot of radionuclides associate with seabed sediments, and that when they are dredged and dumped, those sediments actually help to carry the radioactivity downstream in what we call the dredge plume.
で、いろんな、研究によって証拠、が証明されているんですけど、こういう放射性、堆積物にしても、科学的な堆積物にしても、こういう海底にある、ものが、浚渫されてしまうと、その堆積物が、その放射能だったり、化学的な物質だったりをこう運んで、下流の方に流れていきます。
And that downstream travel of sediments and their associated radioactivity and chemicals can extend for well over 20 kilometers.
で、こういう堆積物が、化学物質だったり、放射性物質をこう運んで、下流に流れると20キロ以上流れる場合もあります。
And when I say well over 20 kilometers, that is because significant downstream travel has been observed at 20 kilometers, but nobody has done the empirical research at distances greater than 20 kilometers.
で、なぜ、20キロっていうのはキロメーター、ごめんなさい。なぜ20キロメーターに、という数値に、こだわるかというと、いろんな研究はされているんですけど、20キロメーター以降の、研究は、まだされていないので、20キロ範囲ではかなり、こういう移動はあるっていうのは、分かっています。
Okay, so I'll refer you back to the earlier presentation about the tritiated water, just to indicate the kind of pathways that people may be exposed by and receive doses of radioactivity released into the marine environment by dredging, carried many kilometers downstream, and then subject to sea to land transfer and or deposition into coastal environments, and of course contamination of seafoods.
で、先ほど見たビデオをちょっと思い出してみてください。その時に話しましたが、このトリチウム水はいろんな経路で、人間を被曝したりします。で、それは、例えば、浚渫によって、その堆積物が、下流の方に運ばれて、そして海から大陸の方に、移動されたり、どこかにこういろんなところに落ち着いて、しまったりします。
Thank you, Madoka. Next slide, please.
次のスライドお願いします。そして、食べ物として、被曝することもあるって言ってました。Thank you.
Right. One of the major management tools used for discussing this problem of dredging and dumping radioactive sediments comes again from the IAEA, and they have documents in which they discuss a concept called de minimis radioactivity.
で、こういう浚渫と投棄を、管理するときに、いろんな、規制に基づいて行われたりするんですけど、多くはこの IAEA からです。で、その中に、デミニミスという、概念があります。
This de minimis guidance document has been adopted by pretty much all of the nuclear nations, and we find it to be very weak. And again, because it was constructed in the 1970s, it is very inadequate in its understanding of the most recent scientific and empirical work on radioactivity.
で、こういう核を保有している国は、ほとんどこの、デミニミス、規制免除の、ガイダンスに基づいて、管理しているんですけど、私たちはこのガイダンスが非常に弱いと思っています。理由はいくつかありますが、一つは、このガイダンスが1970年代に作られました。で、あとは、なので、そして最近の科学研究とか科学者の見解を、しっかりと反映していないという不十分な点も多くあります。
I won't go through all of the problems with this de minimis concept, and we have the document which can be issued to you for that. But basically, it relies on the concept that if you can characterize the radioactivity dose as being so low that no harm would be inflicted, then you can dredge and dump that waste.
で、すべてのこのデミニミスの概念に関して、説明はしませんが、後で、原稿の方、を見てください。そこにはもっと詳しく書かれています。でも、基本的にどういう概念かと言いますと、放射線量が、人に影響、害を与えないほど、線量が低ければ、この、浚渫や投棄をしても大丈夫という概念です。
Good. So we argue for a start that idea immediately contradicts the widely accepted linear no threshold theory of radiological damage, which, put simply, proposes that no dose of man-made radioactivity is so low that it will not cause some damage to some human tissue amongst any exposed population.
で、この IAEA が、提示している、ディミニミスの概念は、LNT 仮説というものに、矛盾、しています。で、この LNT 敷地なし、直線仮説っていうんですけど、これは簡単に説明しますと、人間の、組織に害を与えないほど線量が低いものはないというものですね。これは人為的に作られた放射能の場合です。
It is this guidance on de minimis which clearly recommends followers of the IAEA to rely on gamma emitting testing in a limited number of samples, whereas we would rather say that there should be gamma, beta and alpha testing on a large number of samples in order to fully understand what is happening in the marine environment.
で、この IAEA の、ディミニミスのガイダンスでは、ガンマ線の放出、の分析を、強調しています。で、サンプル数も限られたサンプル数で良いと言っていますが、私たちはガンマだけではなく、やっぱりベータとアルファ線の分析も必要と思っていますし、サンプル数を多く取った方が、分析した方がいいと私たちは思っています。そうしないと海洋環境ではどういう状況なのかを、適切に把握することはできません。
And our campaign also noticed that this outdated 1970s guidance from the IAEA only references 5 radiological dose pathways.
で、私たちのキャンペーンがもう一点に気づきましたけど、それはこの1970年に作られた、ちょっと古くなってしまっているガイダンスですけど、被爆経路を5つしか述べていません。
But we argue that in light of the issue of sea to land transfer, which has been discovered since the IAEA guidelines were constructed, that there are actually 4 additional dose pathways as a result of the sea to land transfer processes, which were discussed in the earlier video.
この IAEA のガイダンスが作られた後に、この海から陸の方に移動する、放射能の研究とか現象がはっきりされたんですけど、で、その、ビデオにも説明された、海から陸の方に移動する放射能は、あと4つの経路もあります。
Good. Okay, so next slide, please.
次のスライドお願いします。
There we are. So, because we could not get our nuclear regulators, nuclear industry or government to undertake any empirical work on the subjects of what might the impacts of the dredge and dump be, we have attempted to carry out some citizen science work. I have led 2 programs of taking sediment samples from different points downstream of the Hinckley site to investigate what the situation may have been before the dredging and dumping, and to see whether there were any actual post-construction work impacts to be seen. And we did find that it did seem that the levels we measured by, all right, translate that, please. I'll start the next sentence properly.
で、私たちは、この、ごめんなさい。政府などを管理する、当局にもっと実際の研究、実験研究を、してほしかったんですけど、なかなかしてくれないので、市民の、実験とか調査、研究を、するしかありませんでした。で、私はその研究に参加したんですけど、2つのプログラムがありました。で、それは堆積物のサンプル、下流からの、ヒンクリーの下流から堆積物のサンプルを取って、で、できる限り、この、ですね、浚渫と投棄が行われた前の状況は一体何だったんだろうという、ふうに、把握したかったんです。で、なので、それが把握できれば、建設の後にどういう措置が必要かもわかるかなと思いました。
So what we found was that even before the dredging took place, there had been quite a lot of construction work in the intertidal area between low tide and high tide, and also in the subtidal on the seabed. There had been quite a lot of construction work, borehole drilling, building seawall protections, and so on and so on. And we discovered that during the 3-year period when that was taking place, before any dredging, we could detect that there were significant increases in concentrations of cobalt-60, which at some sites was increased by 98%. and that there were increases in the presence of alpha emitting americium 241, where we saw 139% increases in some sediment samples, and that organically bound tritium rose in shrimps and shellfish by up to 236%. And we attributed this to disturbance of the seabed sediment, which released radioactivity which had been lying dormant in the mud.
で、この春節の前に、私たちの調査によって分かったことは、春節の前にも、いろんな、建設、作業が行われていました。で、この建設作業は、海面、でも、ごめんなさい、海の、そうですね。海面、そのより深いところでもあったし、この、潮の間の、ところにもいろんな建設がありました。で、どういう建設かっていうと、穴を掘ったり、壁を作ったり、いろいろあったんですけど、こう実際の、浚渫工事の3年前からはそういういろんな工事が行われていて、で、それによって、この海面にあった、放射性堆積物がやっぱり掘り起こされていたので、その結果、コーバルト60の濃度が、98% 増えました。そして、アルファ、アメリシウムの241も 139% 増えました。そして、有機結合トリチウムは、エビと、甲殻類の中に 230% 増えましたので、深刻な問題です。
We collected 12 samples of marine sediment from coastal sites up to 100 kilometers downstream from the Hinkley Point discharges and the dredging site, and we had them analysed for 84 hours, not the standard government 15 hours.
で、私たちは12サンプルを取りました。で、これは海底の堆積物のサンプルですけど、どこから取ったかといいますと、ヒンクリーの放出の場所から、そして、実際、浚渫した場所の 100km 下流の地点でサンプルを取りました。で、このサンプルの、時間数なんですけど、政府が言う15時間ではなく84時間の分析をしました。
The sediment samples from 100 kilometers distant from the dredge site were within 2 kilometers of a dump site where over 100,000 tons of the radioactive sediments were dumped just off the seafront of the capital city of Wales.
で、この、浚渫工事から100km 下流の、地点は、その廃棄物を、放出するところから2km 離れている場所だったんですけど、そこに10万トンの、放出がありました。で、これはウェールズの首都から、非常に近い、ごめんなさい、ちょっと、how many kilometers from the capital did you say?
100. Oh,
From-
sorry, the dump site,
from the capital of Wales.
1.5 kilometers.
首都から 1.5km、しか離れていないところです。Sorry, thank you.
Okay, so although the results of that sediment sampling program, which was 2021, showed that the whole area between 100 kilometers and the dredge site was contaminated by Hinkley radioactivity. The interesting fact was that at the 100-kilometer site, close to the dump site, the local sediment radioactivity levels were very, very close to those found next to the dredge site. And so we concluded that the dump site had had a radiological impact on the adjacent coastal region.
で、私たちの研究は、2021年に結果が出たんですけど、ですね、この浚渫が行われていた場所から 100km の距離のこの地域を、研究しました、調査しました。で、この100km、100km 離れた、浚渫から 100km 離れたところは、廃棄物を、放出した場所から 2km だったんですけど、その調査結果によって分かったことは、その放出場所の、放射、ごめんなさい、その線量は、浚渫する。
まどかさん、ちょっといいですか？
はいはい。
ちょっといいですか？
はい、どうぞ。
Sorry, I think there's a little bit of a confusion. Are you saying that there are 100 kilometers of distance between the dredge site and dump site, and that there's very little difference of contamination value? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And we assume that that is because the dump site has contaminated the nearby environment, and that's why the levels are so high there.
The dump site and the dredge site are 98 kilometers away?
It depends which way you look at it. As the bird flies, they're closer than that. But if you look at the movement of the water body in the Bristol Channel, then the water body is traveling 100 miles. So at that 100-kilometer site at Cardiff, it should be 100 miles away from the Fukushima discharges, the Hinkley discharges, and therefore it should be a lot lower. But because it's so close to the dump site, then the radioactivity from the dump has contaminated the 100-kilometer site and given it levels almost equivalent to those found at the Hinkley site.
いいですか？ごめんなさい。今、ちょっと事実確認と、多分私の通訳の内容の確認が必要だったと思うんですけど、もし必要だったら、くるみさんお願いします。この浚渫が行われた場所から、この、海流が流れる 100km、下流の地点に、いろんなサンプルを取って、その堆積物の放射能を測ったと思いますが、
すいません、まどかさん、いいですか？それちょっと、ややこしいと思うんですけど、一つだけ、福島第一のところではまだ浚渫工事の最中で、しかもその出てきたものを浚渫工事で出てきた汚染土砂をどこに捨てるかっていうのはまだ決まってないと思うんですけれども、ヒンクリーの場合には浚渫工事の場所とその浚渫工事で発生した汚染土泥を海洋投棄してるんです。で、この海洋投棄した場所との浚渫工事との2つのポイントの距離がですね、直線距離じゃなくて海流が流れる距離だと約100キロになると。で、そしてこの、投棄したところの汚染度と浚渫工事をしたところの放射性汚染はほとんど違わないという、そういう お話だと思います。ごめんなさい。
いいえ、その通りです。すいません。で、100km 離れた場所、浚渫工事から 100km 離れているので、本来、その濃度が低いはずなんですけど、そこの、廃棄物を、投棄したことによって、その、なんていうの、放射能の濃度がほとんど変わらないっていうのは、やっぱりその投棄によって、放射性物質が、運ばれていたっていう、そういう理解でいいですか、くるみさん。
はい、そうですね。浚渫工事のところでも、投棄したことを、投棄すると同じような放射性汚染が起こるということです。
はい。Okay, sorry about that, Tim.
No, have we got that clear now?
Yes.
Good. Okay, so my final conclusion, not on this broadcast, but on the issue of what we found out at Hinckley, was that it was plain to us that any disturbance by seabed construction and dredging and dumping inevitably leads to the resuspension and redistribution of radioactivity buried in marine sediments. And that once that stuff has become resuspended, it is distributed and transported over long distances and can give rise to elevated distances many kilometers downstream.
で、私たちの研究の結論なんですけど、このヒンクリー、の、状況を見て、やはり、海底に何らかの建設、もしくは、浚渫、投棄を、してしまうと、そこに、落ち着いていた、放射性、堆積物が、もう一度やっぱり浮遊、します。で、その場合、いろんな流れによって非常に長い距離に流されることもあります。
Okay, good. So now we're on to the final slide.
次のスライドお願いします。
Oh, my mistake, not the final slide.
ごめんなさい。
Yes, sorry. Okay, so what we have seen at Hinckley as a result of dredge and dump, we proposed that sort of impact and behavior of radioactivity is quite likely to occur at the dredge site of the Fukushima discharges.
で、私たちがヒンクリーで見た、現象は福島第一にも起きるのではないかと思っています。
So you can expect that to include gamma emitters like cesium, beta emitters like strontium and tritium and organically bound tritium, and alpha emitters like plutonium and americium. And you can expect that on the evidence of our work to extend for many tens of kilometers downstream in the dredge plume. Wherever any dumping or disposal, if it were to be sea disposal of the dredge wastes occurs, you can expect that the shorelines close to the dump site will also be significantly impacted by radioactivity from the dredge waste.
そして、私たちの研究に基づいて、福島でも、言えると思いますが、ガンマ線を放出するセシウムとか、ベータ線を、放出するストロンチウムとかトリチウム、OBT などと、アルファ線を放出するプル プルトニウム、こういうものは広い範囲で、流されるのではないかと思います。私たちの研究が参考になれば、これは何十キロの、に広がるプルーム、で、こういう放射性物質も、広がると思います。なので、陶器がある場所でも、浚渫がある場所でも、こういう現象が起きますが、もし、海に投棄する場合、広い範囲の海岸も、こういう放射性物質に汚染されると予測しています。
Given that the Fukushima discharges to the sea are not only wastewater from the previously operating 6 reactors and wastewater discharges from the operations carried out during the event, but also you had this prolonged periods of winds blowing from the land to the sea during the event. And we know that when the winds were blowing to the land, significant quantities of plutonium and uranium and other alpha emitters from within the reactor cores and the cooling ponds were deposited on terrestrial surfaces. Some of that will have washed into river systems and gone down through the river systems into the marine environment.
ですね、福島の場合、海に直接、放出されている、廃棄物も、廃棄汚染水もあるんですけど、これはこの6つの、原子炉からだけではなく、ですね、風によって大陸から海の方に、移動された放射能生物も、この放射能物質もあります。例えば、プルトニウム、ユラニウム、そして他のアルファ線を放出しているものも、含まれていますが、これは逆に、風によって、大陸の方にも、陸の方にも移動されるんですけど、それで川に流れて、川からまた海の方に流れる、そういうこともあるでしょう。はい。
I have not seen any accurate, peer-reviewed quantification of the amount of alpha emitters, such as plutonium and uranium, entering the marine environment through the rivers. And similarly, I have not seen any similar calculations of the amount of those alpha emitters which entered the marine environment as a result of the wind blowing from the land to the sea.
Sorry. 私は今のところ、アルファ線を放出するプルトニウムやユラニウムが、どの程度川に流れていたか、こういう、調査研究はまだ、見たことがありません。And sorry, the second one, you haven't seen
calculations for the amount of radioactivity entering the sea when the wind was blowing from the land to the sea during the Fukushima event.
そして、福島第一原発の事故の時に、風によって、大陸から海へ流れた 放射線量の、計算も、今まで見たことがありません。
The nuclear industry and nuclear regulators will probably argue that they have done such calculations, but I would respond by saying if you look at that work, it's largely modeled and hypothetical and not actually empirical.
で、もしかして、この原子力規制委員会など、その産業自体の、方々に質問をすれば、いや、そういう計算はしていますっていうかもしれませんけど、実際の、そういう計算を見た場合、多分ですけど、このモデルや仮説に基づいて、計算されていると思います。実際の、実験によって出てきた数値ではないでしょう。
As a result of this, I would propose strongly that Japanese authorities and TEPCO do not really have a clear understanding of the amount of radioactivity which will be in the sediments that they will be dredging.
したがって日本政府も東電もこの浚渫工事によって、どの程度堆積物の放射線量が掘り起こされるかは多分把握できていないと思います。
On that basis, I would propose that because we don't have an understanding, there should be really serious and very intense analytical studies on the sediments that are going to be dredged and appropriate consideration of the places where that radioactive sediment may be dumped or disposed of, whether it be at sea or on land.
で、こういう明確な状況が把握できていないので、提案としては、しっかり、こういう分析調査を、する必要があります。この堆積物、どういう堆積物がどの程度汚染されていて、で、それを掘り起こす場合、浚渫する場合、どのようにそれを、処理するか、それを海に、投棄するのがいいのか、陸上で、処理すべきなのか、この分析をした後に決めた方がいいと思います。
Next slide, please.
次のスライドをお願いします。これ、くるみさんお願いします。
Back one.
ごめんなさい。This one?
That one. Yes, this is the last slide of the major part of my presentation. And in the UK, our authorities identify what they call coastal critical groups for radioactivity. And these are the people most likely to receive elevated, intermittent, repeated, chronic doses of radioactivity from any given marine discharge.
で、イギリスで政府は、こういうクリティカルグループ、最もリスクが多いグループ、を提示しているんですけど、これはその放射の被曝を、一時的にもしくは、繰り返しもしくは慢性的に、被曝する人たちはどこにあるかということです。
So I've written about this in previous documents and podcasts, and some of it is mentioned in the earlier podcast that we watched. So basically, I find that our coastal critical groups in the UK should be recognised in the context of sea to land transfer activity, which they are not, because sea to land transfer in the UK is considered to stop at the beach and the coast. So it's accepted that it might affect people on the beach, but it's not affected, it's not understood in the UK to be any more important than that.
で、私は、いろんな、資料やポッドキャストで、この話もしたことがあるんですけど、イギリスでは、こういう最も、高いリスクの沿岸グループは、本当にビーチや、沿岸にいる人たちだけと提示しています。この、海から陸の方に移動される、放射性廃棄物の汚染のことなんですけど、このビーチにいる人たちはこのクリティカルグループに入るんですけど、それより内陸は、そういうグループの中には、入っていません。
What we know in the UK is that people living distant from nuclear sites can receive higher dietary doses of marine-sourced radioactivity than people living right next door to a nuclear site. So this is people who are gardening and farming produce.
で、イギリスでは、こう、原子力発電所から遠い人でも、この発電所のすぐ近くにいる人より、被曝線量が高い場合があります。で、これは、なんていうのかな、野菜とかそういうものを食べることによって被曝しています。
So I conclude that the coastal critical groups in the context of dredging and dumping will be found predominantly south and downstream of Fukushima.
なので、私の、推測ですが、福島の場合、一番リスクの高い、沿岸グループは、福島より南と下流に、の海岸にいる人だと思っています。
I conclude that those coastal critical groups will be most strongly impacted by sea to land transfer mechanisms.
で、こういう沿岸にいる人たち、最もリスクを抱えている人たちは、どのように、被曝されるかというと、多分海から陸の方に移動する、放射性物質が問題になると思います。
Those groups will receive dietary doses of sea to land transferred radioactivity at least 10 miles inland and probably much further inland than that.
で、どのように被曝するかっていうと、やっぱり食べ物です。で、これは、海岸から10マイルなので、20キロ弱の、距離で、多分それより内陸の方にいる人たちも、被曝するのではないかと思います。
That if they are receiving dietary doses up to 10 miles inland of radioactivity which has transferred in the wind from the sea from the sea, then that material is airborne, and therefore everybody in that area will also be breathing and inhaling doses of radioactivity. And that people who touch material which is contaminated, such as the farm produce that I've talked about in other places, people who handle that will be receiving contact doses.
で、こういう10マイル内陸の、汚染は風によって、海から陸の方にこの放射性物質が運ばれてくるんですけど、したがって、こう空中にあるものなんですね。で、空中にあるので、吸い込むことによっても被爆することがあります。そして、その、放射線物質がいろんな農作物について、それを触る人たちも、この接触によって、被爆することもあります。
In the UK,
sorry, Tim. I think we have to go on, move on. We're
I was
running
just going
out
to
of
say 2 more
time.
sentences.
Sorry.
2 more sentences?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. In the UK, we have found that marine radioactivity travels at least 250 kilometers from source.
イギリスでは、この海洋にある、放射能は少なくとも 250km の距離を移動することができます。
And in this context of what I've been talking about, I just repeat the widely accepted linear no threshold theory, which put simply proposes that no dose of man-made radioactivity is so low that it will not cause some damage to human tissue amongst the receiving population. Finish.
で、最後に言いたいのは、この、LNT 仮説なんですけど、つまり人間の人為的に作られた放射性物質の場合、人間の組織に害を与えない、濃度は、存在しないということです。終わりです。はい、以上。
Many thanks to Madoka and Karumi
Sorry.
for translating. Bless you.
昨日のパスフィードのニュースでファクトチェックと称してトリチウムが生物凝縮するのは誤りだとの記事を出したのですが、生物濃縮するのかしないのか、ベータ線は紙1枚で、遮蔽できる等々書いてあるのですが、明確に反論するにはどうしたらよいですかってご質問で、リンクが貼ってあるんですけど、私たちヨーロッパの人間はヤフーの記事は読めないんです。すいません。ですから、この質問だけでお答えします。
So there's a question that yesterday in is it Path Feed News, there was a fact check where it says that tritium does not bioaccumulate, or that the concentration doesn't grow, to say that is a mistake, and so I want to know whether which is true, and how to refute it if it's not true, and also that the beta radiation can be shielded with a piece of paper, and it said things like this as well. So if there's ways to refute this, could you tell us?
Okay, well, I can't give you the precise. I would have to go away and look in my library for the scientific references for this. But the simple fact is that when tritium becomes organically bound as OBT, organically bound tritium, it does bioconcentrate, and this has been shown in a number of scientific papers which have been published in peer-reviewed journals in the UK. and some of my previous submissions on podcast and in writing to various Japanese groups has given the scientific reference, and I can provide that, but it will take me time to go back and look in my library to check that for you. But what we can show is that in my local waters in the Bristol Channel, organically bound tritium can reach 63,000 becquerels to the kilogram in apex predators of wildlife, and that is many thousand times greater than the levels of ordinary tritium found in seawater. So for me, that evidence demonstrates the scientific fact that as OBT, organically bound tritium, that can and does bioconcentrate. And if your questioner wishes for the scientific references, if they could leave a note and an email address, I can provide them with that.
はい、ご質問ありがとうございました。今すぐ、その質問に、回答する、科学的な、論文の、リストをくださいって言われても、ちょっと今すぐには提供できないんですけれども、ご希望であれば、後で提供いたしますので、メールアドレスを教えてください。で、私が今、ここの場で回答できるのは、トリチウムはOBT ですね、有機結合型トリチウムになると生物濃縮するということは、もうすでに科学界では証明されています。で、私の住んでいる彼もヒンクリーポイントの近くに住んでるんですけれども、ブリステル海峡の私の住んでいるところで OBT は、sorry, you said 65,000 becquerel per kilo?
63,000 becquerels to the kilogram.
食物チェーンの上にある動物からですね、キロあたり63,000ベクレルの OBT が発見されています。野生動物ですね。ですから、私に関しては、個人に関しては OBT が、トリチウムというよりも、有機結合型トリチウムが生物凝縮するというのは明白であります。というご回答です。ありがとうございました。イギリスで海から上がったのは、セシウムだけでなく、トリチウムもあったでしょうか？その濃度はというご質問です。
So you mentioned that in the UK there was the sea to land transfer of cesium. Was there also tritium included in that? And if so, what were the levels?
Nobody has carried out any studies on the sea to land transfer of tritium. So we do not have data on that, but cesium dissolves into seawater and prefers to remain in seawater in dissolution. So in that respect, its behavior is likely to mimic that of tritium, which is universally described by the nuclear industry as dissolving into seawater and acting and behaving like any other seawater. So tritiated water will become mixed with ordinary seawater and behave exactly the same as seawater does. So it will blow inland as sea spray and micro droplets and marine aerosols. So although nobody has studied it, and isn't it interesting that the nuclear industry has not studied that aspect of one of the largest amounts of radioactivity that they discharge to sea?
はい、それではお答えいたします。今のところですね、トリチウムが、海から陸にどういうふうにして移行しているかという実証研究はありません。ただし、セシウム、はですね、可溶性であって、で、こう ここから言うとトリチウムと非常に似た性質を持っています。ですからセシウムがどういうふうに海から陸へ移行するかということをですね、トリチウムがどういうふうな行動をするかということの、を考える参考になるのです。で、トリチウムはやはりセシウムと同じように海からの波の飛沫やエアロゾルで内陸の方に移行するものと、考えられます。そして私が指摘したいのは、どうして原子力産業がトリチウムの海から陸への移行の調査をしていないのかということです。していないということそのものが非常に興味深い点だと私は思います。はい、以上です。そもそも必要なデータが収集されない IAEA や原子力業界、御用学者が都合の良い情報だけを公開するといった根本的な問題がある中で、独立した科学者の役割はとても大きいと思います。独立した科学者のさまざまな活動を市民が支える方法としては、どのような形が望ましいとお考えでしょうか。
So the next question, I just sent you in the chat too, Tim, but one of the underlying problems seems to be that necessary data has not been properly collected in the first place, and that the IAEA, nuclear plant operators, and scientists hired by the industry and or the government have only published the pieces of information that are convenient for themselves. Under such circumstances, I believe that the role of independent scientists such as yourself is highly important. How best do you think citizens can support various work of independent scientists?
Yeah, that's a great question and a good point. As you can see from what I've talked to you about earlier on, we have felt in the UK that it is important to address these failings, and if you ask the authorities to do the work and they won't do it, then you have to find ways of doing it for yourself. And I believe that citizen science, particularly on the issue of marine radioactivity, is very important, because there are clearly very many pressures on the nuclear industry and government to not do this work because it brings bad news. So I'll let you translate that and then I'll give another sentence.
それは非常に重要なご指摘であり質問だと思います。英国で起こったことを見ますと、非常に大きな欠陥や欠如をこういう調査などに関してですね、欠陥や欠如を政府に指摘することはとても重要なんですが、原子力産業や政府は非常なこういう調査をやらないように圧力を受けていると考えられます。Okay, Tim.
Okay, to follow on, we find, I mean, I have launched and led a number of citizen science projects. You have the issue of finding an independent radiological analyst to analyze your samples if you are taking samples. We use a laboratory in France, which was set up after Chernobyl by a combination of citizens funding and Greenpeace funding. And they are independent and they don't owe the nuclear industry anything in any sense. They've got all their equipment and it's properly verified. So those are the sort of people to use, but they need to bring in funding. So you have to pay them to do the work. We think as far as deciding where to take samples from, it's very good to not to carry out citizen science independent work, because the nuclear industry seems to choose to take samples from sites which are easily accessible by car and by foot, and not necessarily representative of those sediment environments which hold the highest levels of radioactivity. And then I talked to you earlier on about doing long time scale analysis. So we were doing 3-day counting, gamma counting, whereas the nuclear industry and our regulators do 15-hour counting and regulation. So you've got to make all those decisions, but you have to raise the money nonetheless. And this is where it becomes very difficult. We find as citizens groups in the UK that we are restricted to gamma analysis, because alpha and beta analysis are, you can do gamma analysis for a couple of £100, if you can translate that, per sample. But if you want to do alpha analysis, that's going to be thousands of pounds per sample. So we analyze for cesium-137, which is a gamma emitter, and americium-241, which has a gamma signature which can be detected, but americium's major emissions are alpha emissions, and it's closely related to plutonium. So those are two very useful ones to analyze for. But it is expensive. Very time consuming, as all campaigning is, and it often involves you walking out and getting very muddy and very wet to take your own samples. And if anybody wants to undertake that work in Japan, I would be very happy to help, support and advise and provide our experience in doing that work in a bit more detail.
はい、私は市民科学をプロモートするいろんなアクションをしてきましたけれども、このようなことを行うにはですね、独立した分析者、独立したラボというのが必要です。で、私たちのサンプリングを分析しているのは、送るのはフランスのクリラードっていうラボなんですけれども、私たちフランスに住んでいる人たちにとっては馴染みがあるんですけども、チェルノビル事故以降に設立された独立系のラボです。で、そういうところで分析してもらうのはいいんですけども、非常にお金がかかる。だから、どうやってファンドライジングをするか、財政的な、援助を市民の皆さんから集めるかということが非常に大事になってきます。そして、どこでサンプルを収集するかというのをいろんなことを決めない、私たち自身が決めないといけないんですけれども、サンプルの収集する場所というのも非常に重要です。というのは、原子力産業というのは、車で行けるような簡単なところの場所でしかサンプリングをしない。で、そうじゃなくて、汚染が出やすいところとか、なかなかその車では行けないけれども、人々が歩くようなところとか、そういうところのサンプリングもしないといけない。それから、分析時間ですね。15時間じゃなくて、3日間の分析時間を、するとか、そういういろんなことを決めないといけないんですね。そして、先ほどの財政的な問題に戻りますと、ガンマ線分析っていうのは結構比較的安くですね。しかし、アルファ線の分析をするためには、その10倍ぐらい、数百ポンドが数千ポンドに、桁が一つ跳ね上がるんですね。ですから、私たちにはとても無理な分析であるので、私たちが分析するのは、セシウム137と、それからアルファ放射線、放出体ではあるんですけど、アルメシウムはガンマ線の、署名っていうか、関連しているので、アルメシウムも結構分析します。ですから、ですね、それと非常にこういうサンプリングを取るのは時間がかかりますし、泥の中を歩いたりとか、辛い環境なんです。でも、もし日本でそれをやりたい方がいらっしゃるのであれば、私たちの経験を提供するし、サポートしたいと思いますので、ぜひ行ってきてくださいという話です。ありがとうございました。さっきの質問リストについてだけちょっと一言。Team, we are running out of time, so I'm just talking, I'll just tell them about the list of questions. 先ほどスライドの最後に出た休憩中に流していた質問リストなんですけれども、これはティムさんが英国の経験に照らして、助言している東電に聞く質問リストであって、ですからやっぱり日本の市民団体の皆さん、活動家の皆さん、専門家の皆さんで揉んでいただいて、で、やっぱりこれはこう、不適格だとか、こういうのを付け加えた方がいいという、リストを作って、東電に聞かないと、イギリスでも、聞かないと何も情報は出てこなかったので、そこからやっぱり始めるべきだとおっしゃっているので、それに関してもまた、ご助言がありましたら、こちらにお寄せください。はい。
She basically said that the list of questions were ones that you proposed that Japanese people look at, and maybe they need to do some editing or adjusting of the questions, but use them as a basis for questions to ask to TEPCO and the Japanese government. And in the UK, like unless you asked the UK government questions, you didn't get information. Like information doesn't come unless you ask. And so in Japan also, it's important that we ask for information.
That's perfectly true. Good. Well done. Thank you.
ティムさん、杉田さん、鬼塚さん、ありがとうございました。
For speaking about the environmental impacts of the dredging and responding to questions. Thank you.